Picture this. It's April 1945. A massive B-17 flying fortress, engines screaming, hydraulics dead, landing gear jammed, is about to slam belly first onto a runway barely longer than a football field. The pilot has 60 seconds to decide. Bail out and lose the plane, or attempt something never done before, a deliberate gear-up landing on a postage stamp. What happened next would rewrite the rulebook of emergency aviation and save dozens of crippled bombers from certain destruction. But the man who pulled it off? He wasn't supposed to be there at all. If you've ever wondered what separates true genius from reckless desperation, you're about to find out. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about split-second decisions under impossible pressure. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about turning disaster into triumph. The story begins not in the heat of battle, but in the unglamorous backwater airfields of England's eastern coast, spring of 1945. Lieutenant James Howard wasn't your typical war hero. At 34, he was ancient by pilot standards. Most of his fellow aviators were barely old enough to buy a beer back home. Howard had been a crop duster in Iowa, flying rickety biplanes over cornfields, nursing sick engines through summer storms, landing on dirt strips that would make most military pilots break into a cold sweat. The Army Air Forces didn't want him initially. Too old, they said. But as the war consumed younger and younger men, they'd taken him on, not as a bomber pilot, but as a ferry pilot. His job was unglamorous, shuttling damaged aircraft from forward bases back to repair depots, testing patched-up birds, flying the planes nobody else wanted to touch. While his younger counterparts flew combat missions over Germany, Howard nursed wounded bombers across the English countryside. His posting was RAF Woodbridge, a peculiar airfield built specifically for emergencies. The runways stretched nearly 3 kilometers long and twice as wide as normal, a landing strip designed to catch crippled bombers limping home from raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. Every day, shot-up B-17s and B-24s would appear on the horizon, trailing smoke, missing engines, hydraulics leaking, undercarriages shredded by flak. Howard had seen them all, planes held together by cables and prayers, wings more whole than metal, cockpits painted with blood. But Woodbridge was a luxury, vast, forgiving, designed for catastrophe. The real problem was the forward bases in newly liberated France and Belgium. These airstrips had been carved from farmland by Army engineers in days, not months. They were short, narrow, unforgiving strips of pierced steel planking laid over mud. They had none of Woodbridge's safety margins, and as the Allied advance pushed deeper into Germany, more bombers were making emergency landings at these tiny fields, often with catastrophic results. The standard procedure for a bomber with jammed landing gear was simple. Crew bails out, plane crashes, write it off. The Army could replace planes. They couldn't replace trained crews, or so the thinking went. But by April 1945, the calculus was shifting. The war was nearly won, but the bomber fleet was hemorrhaging aircraft. Not to enemy fighters, the Luftwaffe was nearly extinct, but to mechanical failures, battle damage, and landing accidents. Every B-17 that crumpled into a fireball on landing was one less aircraft available for the final push. Howard had been watching this waste with growing frustration. His crop dusting days had taught him something the academy boys hadn't learned. A plane was just a machine, and machines could be coaxed, bullied, and sweet-talked into doing things their designers never imagined. He'd landed planes with dead engines, seized controls, snapped cables. He'd set down on hilltops and dried riverbeds. The size of the plane didn't matter. The principles were the same. One evening in the officers' mess, he'd said as much to a young bomber captain who'd just lost his third aircraft to a landing gear collapse. "These boys are throwing away perfectly good airplanes," Howard had muttered into his coffee. "A belly landing isn't rocket science. You just need room to slide and a bit of nerve." The captain had looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "On a 3-mile runway, maybe. Try that on a 1,500-foot strip in Belgium. You'll cartwheel into the trees." Howard had smiled. "Not if you do it right." He had no idea that within 72 hours he'd have to prove it. The call came before dawn on April 18, 1945. Howard was shaken awake by a young sergeant, still half drunk from the previous night's poker game. "Lieutenant, they need you at operations immediately. Emergency situation at Y-29. Y-29 was Asch, Belgium, a forward airfield supporting tactical bombing runs into the crumbling Reich. Howard had ferried 2 planes out of there the previous week. It was barely adequate in good conditions. A single runway, 4,500 feet of steel matting, surrounded by trees and farm buildings. Adequate for a careful landing. Barely. In the operations room, the situation was laid out with brutal efficiency. A B-17G, tail number 297531, nicknamed Duchess of Dallas, had taken flak damage over a rail yard near Frankfurt. The hydraulic system was destroyed. Landing gear wouldn't deploy. 3 crew injured, including the co-pilot. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Chen, had managed to nurse the bomber across the Rhine, but he was running on fumes and had nowhere to go. Woodbridge was too far. He'd never make it. The nearest emergency field with a long runway was socked in with fog. That left Y-29, where Chen's squadron was based. The problem was obvious. A gear-up landing on a short runway would send the 20-ton bomber sliding off the end at 60 miles per hour, directly into a Belgian farmhouse. "He needs to bail the crew out and ditch in a field," the operations officer said. It wasn't a suggestion. Howard studied the map, the weather, the fuel calculations, the runway dimensions. Something crystallized in his mind, a technique he'd used a dozen times in Iowa, bringing down crop dusters with collapsed gear on strips half the size of Y-29. "What if he doesn't ditch?" Howard said quietly. The room went silent. "What if he belly lands on the runway deliberately, but kills his speed before he touches down? How exactly would he do that?" The operations officer's skepticism was acid. "He comes in high and slow, almost stall speed. Right over the threshold he cuts all 4 engines, not throttle back, cuts them completely. The props windmill and create massive drag. Simultaneously, he pulls full flaps, drops the nose just enough to maintain control authority, and pancakes onto the steel matting with almost no forward momentum. The belly scrapes, acts like a brake. He stops in half the distance of a normal landing." The silence stretched longer. "That's insane," someone finally said. "That's also physics," Howard replied. "I've done it 24 times, just never with something this big." The operations officer stared at him. "You want to talk a 24-year-old pilot with 3 hours of sleep through a dead-stick belly landing on a short runway, using a technique that exists nowhere in any manual, over a radio, in a plane he can barely control?" Howard met his gaze. "No, sir. I want to fly to Y-29 and talk him down in person, from the control tower, where I can see what he's seeing. What happened in the next 10 seconds would determine everything." The officer looked at the map, at the clock, at Howard's weathered face. Making this call meant bypassing protocol, risking an experienced ferry pilot, and potentially turning one catastrophe into 2. "Get to the flight line," he said finally. "You've got 40 minutes before Chen reaches the point of no return." The flight to Y-29 was 17 minutes of screaming anxiety in a patched-up C-47 transport. Howard spent the entire trip mentally rehearsing the physics, the timing, the sequence. Gear-up landings were straightforward in theory. You controlled the impact, kept the wings level, slid to a stop. But bombers were enormous, heavy, built for high-altitude operations, not for pancaking onto runways like wounded geese. The technique he was proposing violated every instinct drilled into bomber pilots. They were trained to keep engines running, maintain speed, never deliberately stall. What Howard was asking Chen to do was essentially perform a controlled crash, turning off the engines at the worst possible moment, bleeding off speed until the plane was barely flying, then dropping it deliberately onto a surface that would tear open the aircraft's belly like a can opener. The margin for error was microscopic. Too fast, and Chen would slide off the runway into the farmhouse, killing everyone aboard, and probably a Belgian family. Too slow, and he'd stall 10 feet up, dropping like a stone and crumpling the fuselage. 2 nose high, the tail would strike first and send the bomber cartwheeling. 2 nose low, they'd dig in and flip. It had to be perfect. The C-47 slammed down at Y-29 with minutes to spare. Howard sprinted to the mobile control tower, really just a radio truck with a good view of the runway. The field's commanding officer was already there, pacing, chain-smoking. "Your boy's got maybe 20 minutes of fuel," he said without preamble. "He's circling at 8,000 feet. Crew's scared witless. Chen's holding it together, but he's green. 42 missions, but never dealt with anything like this." Howard grabbed the radio handset. "Duchess of Dallas, this is Woodbridge Ferry 1. Do you copy?" The response came back immediately, young voice tight with controlled panic. "Ferry 1, this is Duchess. Who the hell are you?" "I'm the guy who's going to walk you through this. What's your status?" "Hydraulics gone. Gear definitely not coming down. We've tried everything. Fuel for maybe 15 more minutes. 3 wounded in back, 1 serious. I've got 1 good engine, 2 running rough, 1 completely dead. Flight controls are sluggish but responding." Howard closed his eyes, visualizing the aircraft. "Chen, I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I've done this. Not in a fort, but the principle's the same. You're going to perform a powered-off, full-flap, high-drag approach with an intentional stall landing. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Silence on the radio. Then, "You want me to cut my engines on final approach?" "Not all at once. It's a sequence. And yes, I know it contradicts everything you've been taught. But if you try a conventional belly landing on this runway, you'll roll off the end at 50 knots and kill everyone. This technique will get you stopped in 2,500 feet, maybe less." Another pause. "How do you know?" "Because I've been landing broken planes on short runways since before you had your license, son. But we're burning time. I need a yes or no. What would you do in Chen's position? Trust a voice on the radio suggesting a technique that sounded like suicide, or follow the book and bail out, letting a multi-million-dollar aircraft and 3 wounded men take their chances? Think about that, and leave your answer in the comments." The radio crackled. "Talk me through it." Howard's hands were steady as he keyed the mic, but his heart hammered. There was no room for error, no second chances. "Okay, Chen, here's the sequence. First, I need you to do a test run. Come around for a practice approach, but don't commit. I want to see how she handles at minimum speed with full flaps." "Roger. Beginning turn to final." Howard stepped out of the radio truck, binoculars raised. The sky was that peculiar gray that Northern Europe does so well. Clouds like dirty wool, visibility maybe 3 miles. Then he saw it, the Duchess of Dallas, looking surprisingly intact from this distance. As it came around, he could see the damage. The number 3 engine's prop was feathered and motionless, oil streaking back along the wing. The tail section showed ragged holes from flak. "Full flaps deployed," Chen's voice reported. "She's mushing pretty bad. Controls are heavy." "What's your airspeed?" 110 indicated, dropping to 105. Getting buffet. That's your edge right there. At full combat weight, your stall speed with full flaps is probably 95, maybe 100. You're riding just above it. How does she feel? Like flying a barn door through molasses. Howard allowed himself a grim smile. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. Now bring it around again, but this time I need you to start your approach at 1,500 feet, 3 miles out. Much higher and steeper than normal. The Duchess climbed away, banking slowly. Howard turned to the base commander. "I need the crash crews positioned at the 1,000-foot mark, not the approach end. And get those farm buildings evacuated, just in case." "Already done. Firefighters think you're insane, for the record." They might be right. The bomber came around again, lining up on final approach. From this angle it looked enormous. A 74-foot wingspan, tail reaching 3 stories high, 4 massive radial engines that together produced 4,800 horsepower. Except one was dead, 2 were sick, and Howard was about to ask Chen to shut down all of them at the worst possible moment. "Okay, Chen, this is the real thing. Start down now, throttle back, establish your glide. I want 1,500 feet at 3 miles. That gives you a descent angle roughly twice as steep as normal. You're going to feel like you're diving. Ignore that feeling. Beginning descent, airspeed 120, altitude 1,400. Good, full flaps now. And I need everyone who can brace to get into crash positions. Wounded secured? Secured as we can." The B-17 descended, nose tilted down at an angle that looked wrong, unnatural. But Howard had seen this before. The steep approach was everything. It allowed them to bleed off speed while maintaining control, arriving at the threshold with minimal forward momentum. Altitude 800, speed 100. She's shaking like she wants to quit. She won't quit, not yet. Keep the nose down, maintain your angle. Engine still running? Affirmative. Okay, here's the critical part. When I call it, you're going to pull mixture to idle cutoff on all 4 engines simultaneously. Not the throttles, the mixture. Kill the fuel flow completely. The props will keep windmilling from the airflow, and they'll create massive drag. Simultaneously, you need to pull back gently, and I mean gently, on the yoke to arrest your descent. You're balancing between a stall and a dive. The goal is to arrive at the runway threshold at about 95 knots, maybe 10 feet off the ground, with the aircraft settling, not flying. Jesus Christ. Chen's voice had gone tight again. You can do this. I've seen pilots half as skilled pull it off. Trust the plane. Trust the physics. Call your altitude. 500 feet. 400. Speed 105. The Duchess was enormous now, filling Howard's vision. He could see faces in the cockpit windows, could see the sun glinting off the plexiglass nose. The bomber looked like it was falling more than flying, descending at an angle that would horrify any flight instructor. 300 feet. Okay, Chen, we're committed now. Reduce throttle to minimum, but keep the engines alive for another 10 seconds. The next 15 seconds would determine everything. Howard watched the bomber descend, his entire consciousness focused on its angle, its speed, its relationship to the ground. In his peripheral vision, he could see the crash crews tensing, firefighters gripping their equipment. 200 feet, speed 100. She's mushing hard, Howard. I don't think... Trust it. You're doing perfect. See that threshold marker? When you cross it, I want you at 50 feet, no higher. Begin throttling back now. Ease it down. The B-17's engine note dropped, that distinctive sound of radial engines winding down. The bomber seemed to hang in the air, suspended between flight and falling. 150 feet. God, this feels wrong. It's right. What's your airspeed? 98 and dropping. Perfect. Okay, Chen, do you see where you are relative to the runway? I'm high. We're going to overshoot. No, you're exactly where you need to be. In 5 seconds, you'll cross the threshold. When I say now, you're going to do 3 things simultaneously. Mixture cut off all engines, pull back gentle pressure on the yoke, maybe 3 inches, and maintain your wing level with everything you've got. The nose will want to drop when the engines quit. Don't let it drop too fast. Arrest the descent, flare just like a normal landing, but understand you'll be settling fast. You're going to hit harder than any landing you've ever made. That's expected. The goal is wings level, nose slightly up, belly taking the impact evenly. I understand. Chen's voice had changed, still scared but focused now, committed. Crossing threshold in 3, 2. The B-17 loomed over the runway's edge, massive, barely flying, seeming to float on nothing but will and momentum. Now, cut mixture, pull back, hold it level. The engine sound changed instantly, a sudden silence broken only by wind noise and the whirring of windmilling propellers. The bomber's nose pitched down slightly, then rose as Chen pulled back. For a heartbeat, it hung there, defying gravity, suspended in that impossible moment between flying and falling. Then it dropped. The belly hit the steel matting with a sound like a building collapsing, a tremendous metallic shriek as aluminum met steel at 90 miles per hour. Sparks erupted in a fountain 20 feet high. The entire aircraft shuddered, seemed to compress, then began to slide. This was the moment Howard had planned for. The friction of metal on metal creating enormous drag. The bomber wasn't rolling, it was grinding, scraping, shedding speed with every foot. The steel matting acted like sandpaper, tearing at the aluminum belly, but also stopping the massive aircraft far faster than wheels ever could. The tail stayed up. Good. That meant Chen had kept the nose slightly high, using the curvature of the fuselage to maximize friction. The wings stayed level. Miraculous, considering the forces involved. The bomber continued its terrible slide, shrieking, sparking, pieces of metal tearing away, but decelerating rapidly. 1,000 feet down the runway, 1,500, 2,000. Howard held his breath. At 2,000 feet, the bomber was still moving, but slowly now, maybe 20 miles per hour. At 2,200 feet, it was barely crawling. At 2,400 feet, 3/4 of the way down the available runway, the Duchess of Dallas came to a complete stop. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was profound. No engines, no movement, just the ticking of hot metal and the distant sound of alarm bells as crash crews raced forward. Then the top hatch popped open, and men began spilling out, dropping to the ground, some running, some limping, some being carried. Howard counted them. 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10. The entire crew, alive. The base commander beside him released a breath he'd been holding for 30 seconds. Holy Mother of God. Howard lowered his binoculars, hands shaking now that it was over. Get medical to those wounded, and I need to talk to Chen. He reached the bomber as Chen slid down from the cockpit, legs giving out when he hit the ground. Howard caught him, held him upright. The young pilot's flight suit was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling violently. You did it, Howard said quietly. Perfect execution. Textbook. Except there's no textbook for what you just did. Chen looked at him, eyes wide, still processing. The way it felt when the engines quit. I thought we were dead. I thought I'd killed us all. But you trusted the technique. That took more guts than any combat mission. Around them, the crash crews were spraying foam, securing the aircraft, helping wounded crew members into ambulances. The Duchess of Dallas sat in a pool of fire suppression foam and aviation fuel, her belly torn to shreds, but her fuselage intact, wings unbroken. Repairable, Howard thought. She'd fly again. But the real question was whether anyone else would try this technique, whether what they'd just pulled off was a one-time miracle or something reproducible. That answer would come sooner than anyone expected. News traveled fast in the Army Air Forces, especially news that contradicted everything in the manual. By sunset, every operations officer in England and France had heard about the Duchess of Dallas. By the next morning, Howard had been summoned to 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe. He'd expected a reprimand. What he got was a room full of colonels, a 3-star general, and a lot of very pointed questions. Lieutenant Howard, you instructed a pilot to cut all engines on final approach to a short runway. Are you aware that nowhere in any B-17 emergency procedures is such a technique mentioned? Howard stood at attention. Yes, sir, because nobody's ever tried it on a short field before. And if it had failed? If Chen had stalled at 50 feet and dropped like a stone? Then I'd be responsible for killing 10 men. But it didn't fail, sir, because the physics are sound. The general, a veteran bomber pilot himself, Howard noted from his ribbons, leaned forward. Explain the physics to me. Pretend I'm an idiot. Howard relaxed slightly. This was a test, but an honest one. Sir, the problem with conventional gear-up landings is energy management. A B-17 at combat weight, even with flaps, crosses the threshold at around 120 knots. When you belly land at that speed, you've got tremendous kinetic energy. On a long runway, you can afford to let friction gradually bleed off that energy. On a short runway, you can't. He moved to a blackboard, began sketching. The technique I used treats the landing as a controlled stall rather than a slide. By approaching high and steep, we exchange altitude for speed control. By cutting mixture rather than just throttling back, we create maximum drag from the windmilling props, roughly equivalent to adding air brakes. By timing the flare precisely, we arrive at the surface with minimum forward velocity. The belly impact becomes the primary braking method, not a consequence we're managing. One of the colonels spoke up. The stress on the airframe is significant, Howard acknowledged, but a B-17 is built to take punishment. Flak damage, battle stress, these aircraft are designed with enormous structural margins. A gear-up landing at low speed is well within those margins. The belly skin gets destroyed, certainly, but the main spars, the frames, the critical structure, they're fine. The general studied the diagram. How many times have you personally performed this technique? In crop dusters, 23 times. In military aircraft, once, yesterday. And you believe any competent pilot could learn it? Howard chose his words carefully. Any competent pilot who can suppress their instincts and trust the physics. Yes, sir. The technique itself isn't complicated, but it feels wrong at every step. Cutting engines when you're barely above stall speed goes against every survival instinct. That's the challenge, not the flying, but the psychology. The room fell silent. The general exchanged glances with his staff, some unspoken communication passing between them. Lieutenant, we've got a problem. We're winning this war, but we're hemorrhaging aircraft to landing accidents. Just this week, we've written off 16 bombers to gear-up crashes on short runways. 16. That's more than we've lost to fighters in the same period. If this technique of yours can save even a fraction of those aircraft. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the operations center. I'm authorizing a test program. You'll train a cadre of instructor pilots in this technique. We'll designate specific airfields where it's approved. We'll modify the emergency procedures manuals. And if it works, if we can prove it's reproducible and safe, we'll disseminate it across the theater. Howard felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Sir, with respect, I'm a ferry pilot. I'm not an instructor. There are better pilots. There are younger pilots, the general interrupted. Better trained pilots, by-the-book pilots. But there's not a single one who's landed a B-17 gear-up on a short field using this technique. You're the only expert we've got, Lieutenant, so you're going to become an instructor whether you like it or not. 3 days later, Howard found himself at a training field in East Anglia with 6 bomber pilots, a blackboard, and a B-17 that had already been condemned for scrapping, its landing gear permanently retracted, perfect for practice. The training was brutal, not physically, but psychologically. These were combat veterans, men who'd flown through flak storms over Berlin, who'd brought home bombers with engines shot off and half the crew dead. They were brave beyond measure. But asking them to deliberately cut engines on final approach paralyzed them. The first training flight nearly ended in disaster. Captain Mike Sullivan, a veteran of 63 combat missions, was at the controls. He'd understood the briefing, acknowledged the technique, talked through the procedures flawlessly on the ground. But when the moment came to cut the mixture on final approach, he froze. I can't, his voice crackled over the radio. Howard, I can't do it. Every instinct is screaming. Then go around, Howard said calmly from the ground. Circle, reset, try again. 3 attempts. Each time Sullivan got closer. Each time at the critical moment, his hand wouldn't move to the mixture controls. After the 3rd attempt, Sullivan landed normally, gear down, by the book, and climbed out of the cockpit ashen-faced. I'm sorry, I can't override the training. Cutting engines that low, it feels like suicide. Howard nodded slowly. He'd anticipated this. It's not failure, Mike. It's honest feedback. This technique isn't for everyone, and that's okay. But I need to understand the barrier. Walk me through what you're feeling. They sat on the wing and Sullivan talked. What emerged was fascinating. It wasn't fear of crashing, precisely. These men had accepted the possibility of death long ago. It was the act of deliberately inducing what looked like a crash. Taking an aircraft that was still flying, still controllable, and intentionally putting it into what appeared to be a catastrophic situation. "It's one thing to ride a damaged plane down," Sullivan explained. "You're managing a situation forced on you. But this, you're choosing it. Choosing to kill your engines. Choosing to stall. Choosing to fall. It feels like stepping off a cliff when there's still solid ground under your feet." That night, Howard rewrote the training program. The issue wasn't skill. It was psychological conditioning. He needed to help pilots reframe the technique, not as inducing a crash, but as executing a precisely controlled descent using unconventional tools. He started using simulators, not high-tech machines, but simple wooden mock-ups where pilots could practice the sequence without stakes. He introduced the technique gradually. First, engine-off approaches with gear down, then steeper approaches, then combining elements, building muscle memory and comfort before asking them to commit. It took 2 weeks, but gradually, it worked. Sullivan was the breakthrough. On his 4th day of training, he executed a perfect gear-up landing, cutting mixture at exactly the right moment, flaring smoothly, settling onto the runway with textbook precision. When he climbed out, he was grinning like a kid. "It clicked," he said. "The moment I stopped thinking of it as cutting engines and started thinking of it as activating the ultimate air brake, it clicked. You're not inducing a crash, you're using every available drag device, flaps, prop windmilling, fuselage friction, to stop in minimum distance. It's elegant, actually." By the end of April, Howard had trained 18 pilots. The technique was spreading through word of mouth, modifications and improvements suggested by pilots who'd executed it successfully. Someone figured out that a slight wing-down approach helped if there was crosswind. Another pilot discovered that cutting the outboard engines a half-second before the inboard ones helped maintain directional control. The manual emerged organically, pilots comparing notes, Howard documenting what worked, what didn't, what killed you, and what saved you. By early May, it had a name: the dead stick emergency landing technique, though most pilots called it the Howard method, or just pulling a Howard. And then came the real test: combat conditions, damaged aircraft, pilots who'd never trained for it, flying on instinct and desperation. The call came on May 3rd. A B-17, named Rebel Queen, had taken catastrophic flak damage over the Ruhr Valley. Hydraulics destroyed, gear jammed up, 2 engines gone, fire in the bomb bay extinguished but fuselage compromised. The pilot, 2nd Lieutenant James Rooker, had gotten his crew across Allied lines but was running on fumes. The nearest field was a forward strip in Holland, short, narrow, no safety margins. Rooker had never trained in Howard's technique, didn't know it existed, was planning to bail out the crew and ditch, until someone in operations said, "Wait, there's a technique for this, some crazy dead stick thing. We've got the manual." They patched Howard through on the radio. He had maybe 5 minutes to explain a technique that took days to master, to a pilot he'd never met, in an aircraft far more damaged than anything they'd practiced with. "Lieutenant Rooker, listen very carefully. I'm about to tell you something that sounds insane, but it will save your plane and crew." What happened next would determine whether the Howard method was truly viable under combat conditions, or just a training exercise that fell apart when chaos intervened. Rooker was from Georgia, 23 years old, 5th mission as aircraft commander. His voice on the radio was steady, but edged with exhaustion. "Sir, with respect, I've got maybe 10 minutes of fuel, a plane that's barely flying, and you're telling me to cut my remaining engines on purpose?" "I know how it sounds," Howard replied, watching the field in Holland through the operations center's plotting board. "But I've talked 7 pilots through this in the last week. It works. The question is whether you trust me enough to try." Silence on the radio. Howard could hear the background noise, wind screaming through the damaged fuselage, someone groaning in pain, the labored sound of struggling engines. "What happens if I screw it up?" Rooker finally asked. "Same thing that happens if you bail out. You lose the plane. Difference is, this way you're in control, and your wounded don't have to jump." Another pause. "Okay, talk me through it." They had 6 minutes. Howard compressed days of training into a rapid-fire sequence of instructions, using the simplest language possible: high and steep, minimize speed, cut mixture, not throttles, flare gently, trust the belly to brake. Rooker repeated it back, asking clarifying questions, his voice growing more confident. "I'm beginning my approach now," Rooker said. "Field in sight, wind is gusting west to east. Recommend which runway?" "Doesn't matter. Use whichever gives you the straightest approach. You don't have time for pattern work." "Roger. Starting descent. Altitude 1800. Speed 115. Full flaps deployed." Howard closed his eyes, visualizing what Rooker was seeing. The small Dutch airfield would look impossibly tiny from altitude, a strip of darker ground amid farmland. The damaged bomber would be responding sluggishly, controls heavy, every input a negotiation rather than a command. "Looking good, Rooker. Steeper angle. Remember, you need to arrive slow. Increasing descent rate. God, this feels wrong." "I know. Trust it. Call your altitude." 1,000 feet. 800. Speed 110. "She's shaking, Howard. I don't know if she'll hold together." "She'll hold. The fort's tougher than you think. How's your alignment?" "Centered on the runway. 600 feet. This was the moment Howard had learned to dread, the point where training either held or shattered. Rooker had never done this before, had minutes of instruction versus weeks of practice, was flying a far more damaged aircraft than any they'd trained with, and was about to deliberately induce what every instinct screamed was a fatal stall. 400 feet. God help me. 300. "Rooker, you're doing perfect. Throttle back now. Bleed off speed, but keep the engines alive for 10 more seconds." Throttling back. Speed 100. 95. "Beautiful. Okay. See the threshold coming up?" "I see it. We're high, I think." "You're perfect. That's exactly the profile we want. When I say now, mixture cut off, gentle flare, hold wings level. 3 seconds. 2. Now." Over the radio, Howard heard the engine note change, die to silence. Heard Rooker's breathing quicken. Heard someone in the background shouting a prayer. Then, impact. The radio cut out for 3 seconds, probably from the shock of landing. When it came back, there was chaos. Voices yelling, metal grinding, the sound of movement. "Rooker, report." Nothing. "Rebel Queen, this is operations. Respond." Static. Howard's heart sank. Had he just killed 10 men with bad advice? Had the damage been too severe, the aircraft too compromised? Had Rooker's inexperience? The radio crackled. "Operations, this is Rooker." The voice was shaky, breathless, but alive. "We're down. We're stopped. Jesus Christ, we're alive. Everybody's alive." The operations center erupted in cheers. Howard sagged against the plotting table, legs suddenly weak. "Howard?" Rooker's voice again. "I don't know what you just had me do, but it worked. We hit hard, slid maybe 2,000 feet, tore the belly to pieces, but we stopped with runway to spare. We stopped. God, we actually stopped." Over the next 3 weeks, as Germany collapsed and the war in Europe ended, the Howard method was used successfully 23 more times. Not every attempt worked. 3 aircraft crashed when pilots mistimed the technique, though all crews survived. But the success rate was extraordinary. Where previously gear-up landings on short runways meant certain write-offs, now 70% of aircraft were repairable. The technique spread beyond bombers. Fighter pilots used it, transport crews. Even a British Mosquito crew executed a modified version. By VE Day, it was in the official manual, taught at training bases, considered standard emergency procedure. Howard himself flew until Japan surrendered, then went home to Iowa. He never sought recognition, never publicized his role. When the Air Force tried to give him a medal, he declined, saying he'd just applied common sense to an obvious problem. But pilots knew. In ready rooms across the shrinking Army Air Forces, the story was told and retold. The crop duster who'd saved dozens of bombers with a technique nobody believed would work, who'd turned a Hail Mary into a science. James Sullivan, the pilot who'd struggled so much in training, ended up writing the definitive manual on the technique. He interviewed Howard for hours, documenting every nuance. In the foreword, he wrote, "What Lieutenant Howard gave us wasn't just a landing technique. He gave us permission to think differently about impossible situations, to question received wisdom, to trust physics over fear." That lesson extended far beyond aviation. Robert Chen, the pilot of the Duchess of Dallas, became a commercial airline pilot after the war. He flew for 37 years without a single incident, and on his retirement flight, he carried a piece of the Duchess's belly skin in his pocket, a chunk of torn aluminum he'd kept as a reminder of the day he learned that impossible just meant nobody'd figured out how yet. As for the Duchess of Dallas herself, she was repaired, returned to service, and survived the war. Today, a piece of her fuselage is in the National Air and Space Museum, with a plaque that reads, "First aircraft to successfully employ the Howard Method emergency landing technique, April 18, 1945. The question isn't whether you'll face impossible situations. You will. The question is whether you'll have the courage to try an unconventional solution when conventional wisdom says there's no hope. Whether you'll trust physics over fear, innovation over instinct." James Howard did. And because he did, dozens of crews came home who otherwise wouldn't have. Sometimes the difference between disaster and miracle is just one person willing to question the rule book and ask, what if we tried it differently? What impossible problem are you facing that might just need a different approach? Think about it, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that impossible isn't permanent. If this story changed how you think about problem solving under pressure, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this. Stories of ordinary people who rewrote the rules when it mattered most, and you won't want to miss them.